today we deal with chapter 4 of history, tribals, Dikus and the vision of golden age. So in this chapter we'll learn about tribals and how the tribals lived in our country, how did the British rule affect the lives of the tribal people, and a closer look at the lives of different tribes. So let's say an overview of what we are going to study in this chapter. So in the last chapter we saw how the Britishers came to India and how they established their rule through trade. And we saw the effect of this British rule on peasants, on landlords, on the kings, etc. Here we'll discuss how the tribals faced problems under the British rule and with the Europeans who they considered as Dikus. Dikus was a term which is given to the outsiders like Europeans or the Britishers. So in this chapter we'll see how the tribals lived before the British rule and what happened to the tribal people under the British rule, that is how their lives changed. We'll also talk about a tribal leader called as Birsa Munda who led a revolt against these Dikus to free the tribal land. So who were these tribal people? The tribals were a group of people that lived in an enclosed society with customs and rituals that were very different from the caste-driven societies which we see in towns and villages. For example, in Brahmins we see there is an upper caste, lower caste, but in such tribal societies they had no social divisions. All those who belonged to the same tribe, they shared a common ties of kinship. Kinship means like a close relationship, like a family. But this did not mean that there was no social and economic difference within those tribes. So first let's see how the tribal groups lived in our country. By the 19th century, the tribal people lived in different parts of India. See here we can see the location of some tribal groups in India. And these tribal groups, they lived a very productive life. Like some were jhum cultivators, some were hunters and gatherers, some were herded animals, and some took to settled cultivation. So let's discuss each of these points briefly. So some of the tribal groups were jhum cultivators. We have discussed about jhum cultivation or shifting cultivation in geography chapter 4. I think it's agriculture. If you have any doubt, please consider the corresponding slides. So the tribal groups, they practiced jhum cultivation or shifting cultivation. So what do they do in this shifting cultivation? They do agriculture in small patches of land which is mostly in forest. So first the cultivators, they clear off the forest, that is they cut the tree tops to allow the sunlight to reach the ground, and then they burn the vegetation on the land so as to clear it for cultivation. Then they spread the ash which contain potash to fertilize the soil. Then they use equipments like axe to cut trees and hoe to scratch the soil in order to prepare it for cultivation. And they didn't use any types of plow to cultivate or to sow the seeds. They simply scattered the seeds on the field instead of plowing the land. And once the crop was ready and harvested, they moved to another field. So this technique was also called as slash and burn technique. And once a field has been cultivated, then it is left uncultivated for several years. That is, they'll shift to another place. Now the shifting cultivators, they were found in hilly and forested tracts of northeast and central India. Now some of the tribal groups were hunters and gatherers. That is, in many regions the tribal groups lived by hunting animals and gathering forest produce. They saw forest as essential for survival. Now the Kons were such a community living in the forest of Orissa. Now how did they live? They regularly went out on collective hunts. They ate the fruits and roots collected from the forest. They used many forest shrubs and herbs for medicinal purposes and sold the forest produce in local markets. At times they even exchanged goods, getting what they needed in return for their valuable forest produce. However, when the supplies of this forest produce shrank, these tribal people had to wander in search of work as laborers. But many of these tribal people, like the Baigas of central India, they were reluctant to do work because the Baigas, they saw themselves as a people of the forest who could only live on the produce of forest, and it was below the dignity of a baiga to become a laborer. So the tribal peoples, they often needed to buy and sell in order to be able to get the goods that were not produced within the locality. So as a result, this led to the dependence on the traders and the moneylenders. But these traders, they often brought this forest produce from the tribals at very cheap prices, but they sold their goods to the tribals at very high prices. As a result, what happened? The tribals had to take loan from this moneylenders, and the moneylenders, they gave such loans to the tribals with a very high interest. So for the tribals, the market and commerce often meant debt and poverty, and they saw these moneylenders and traders as evil outsiders and the cause of their misery. Now many tribal people, they lived by herding and rearing the animals. They were pastoralists, which means cattle or sheep farmers who moved with their herds of cattle or sheep according to their seasons. That is, when the grass in one place is exhausted, they moved to another. Some of the examples of the tribes which herded animals were the Van Gujars of Punjab hills and the Labadis of Andhra Pradesh. This both community were cattle herders. The Gadis of Kullu, they were shepherds, and the Bakarwals of Kashmir reared goats. The same tribal groups, they preferred to settle down and cultivate their fields in one place year after year instead of moving from place to place. They began to use plough, and gradually they got rights over the land they lived on. For example, the Mundas of Chota Nagpur. The land belonged to the clan as a whole. All the members of the clan, they regarded themselves as the descendants of the original settlers. Therefore, all of them had the rights on the land, and very often the people within the clan, they became chiefs and other the followers. Now, powerful men, they often rented out their land instead of cultivating it themselves. So the Britishers, when they came to India, they saw how these tribal people lived, and they saw that the settled tribal groups like the Gonds and the Santals are far more civilized than the hunter-gatherers or the shifting cultivators. And those who lived in the forest were considered as wild and savage, and that they needed to be settled and civilized. So let's now discuss how the British rule affected the tribal lives. The lives of the tribal groups changed considerably during the British rule. So let us see what these changes were. First, we'll see what happened to the tribal chiefs, then what happened to the shifting cultivators, then how the British rule changed the forest laws and their impact on tribals, then the problem with trade and the search of work by the tribals. So let's discuss each of these changes briefly. So first, let's see what changes happened to the tribal chiefs. Now, before the arrival of the British, the tribal chiefs were considered as very important people. They had the right to administer and control their territories. And in some places, they had their own police and they could decide on the local rules of the land and forest management. But under the British rule, the functions and powers of the tribal people changed. How did they change? These tribal chiefs, they were allowed to keep their land titles and rent out lands, but they lost their administrative power and they were forced to follow the laws made by the British. They also had to pay the tribute to the British and discipline the tribal groups on the behalf of British. That is, these tribal chiefs, they lost their authority that they already had, that is a power, and they were asked to discipline the tribes on the behalf of the British government, and they were unable to fulfill their traditional functions as well. Now let's see what happened to the shifting cultivators. Now the Britishers, they were not comfortable with this shifting cultivators. They wanted these tribal groups to settle down and become peasant cultivators, as these settled peasants were easier to control and administer. And the Britishers, they also wanted a regular revenue source for the state. So they introduced land settlements. That is, they measured the land, they defined the rights of each individual to that land, and they fixed the revenue or the tax the farmer had to pay to the state. And they even declared some of the peasants like landowners and other as tenants. In chapters 2, we have already discussed about this land settlements and how these tenants were to pay the rent to the landowner, who in turn paid to the revenue to the state. If you have any doubts, please refer the corresponding slides. But the British effort to settle the Jhum cultivators was not very successful. Why? Because the settle ploughed cultivation is not easy in the area where water is scarce and the soil is dry. And because of that, all the shifting cultivators, they suffered as they did not produce any good yields. Here we can see how the tribal workers work in a rice field in Andhra Pradesh. So the Jhum cultivators in northeast India, they insisted on continuing with the traditional practice. Here we can see the Bill woman cultivating the forest. And in many forest areas in Gujarat, the shifting cultivation continued. So facing the widespread protest, the Britishers had to finally allow them the right to carry on shifting cultivation in some part of the forest. So let's now discuss how the Britishers changed the forest laws and their impact on tribal people. Now, the life of the tribal groups, we have already seen how they are directly connected to the forest. So the Britishers, they extended the control over all the forest and declared that forests were the state property. For example, some forests were classified as reserved forest for they produced timber which the British wanted. And in such forest, the Jhum cultivators were not allowed to move freely, practice Jhum cultivation, collect fruits or even hunt animals. So what happened? Many Jhum cultivators were therefore forced to move to other areas in search of work and livelihood. But once the Britishers stopped the tribal people from living inside the forest, they faced a problem. What was the problem? They didn't have proper labours to cut the trees for railway sleepers or to transport logs. So the colonial officials or the British officials, they came up with a solution. So this was the solution. The Britishers, they decided that they would give the Jhum cultivators small patches of land in the forest and allow them to cultivate these on a condition that they would have to provide labor to the forest department. That is, the Britishers, they allowed the Jhum cultivators to live in the forest, but they have to work as laborers in the forest department at minimum wages. So in many regions, the forest department established such forest villages to ensure a regular supply of cheap labor. So many tribal groups, they reacted against this colonial forest laws. They disobeyed these new rules and they continued with the practices that were declared illegal by the Britishers. And at some times, rebellion was also started, like the revolt of the Songram Sangma in 1906 in Assam and the forest satyagraha of the 1930s in the central province. So the next change was with the trade. So let's discuss the problem with the trade. Now during the 19th century, the tribal groups found that these traders and the money lenders, they were coming into the forest more often, wanting to buy more forest produce, offering more cash loans to the tribal people and asking them to work for wages. It took some time for the tribal groups to understand the consequence of what was happening. So let's understand this more with the case of the silk growers. So let's consider the case of silk growers. In the 18th century, the Indian silk was in demand in the European markets. So the East India Company officials, they tried to encourage the silk production to meet the growing needs. Hazaribagh, which is now in the present Jharkhand, was an area where the Santals reared silk and the silk traders sent in their agents who gave loans to them to collect the cocoons. And the growers, they were paid rupees 3 to rupees 4 for 1,000 of cocoons. And then they were exported to Burdwan or Gaya, where they were sold at 5 times the price. Here we can see the tribal women, Godara of tribe, weaving, see, with the silk. Now the middlemen who arranged the deals between the exporters and the silk growers, they made huge profits. By selling this, they paid rupees 3 and 4 for 1,000 cocoons and they sold at 5 times the price. So who made the profits? The middlemen. And the silk growers, they earned very little. Understandably, many tribal groups, they saw this market and the traders as their main enemies. So let's discuss the change in the tribal lives when they searched for works. Now the plight of or the situation of the tribals who had to go far away from the homes in search of work was even worse. From the late 19th century, tea plantations started coming up and mining also became an important industry. So the tribals were recruited in large numbers to work in such tea plantations like that in Assam and the coal mines of Jharkhand. And these tribals, they were recruited through contractors who paid them very low wages and even prevented them from returning home. So the situation was very worse. So far we saw how the tribal groups lived in our country and what all changes did the Britishers brought to the lives of the tribal people. So now let's take a closer look what happened to the tribal people after all these changes took place. So through the 19th and 20th centuries, the tribal groups in different parts of the country started rebelling against these changes in laws, the restrictions on their practices, the new taxes they had to pay, and the exploitation by the traders and the money lenders. So some of the rebellions are these: the Coal Rebellion in 1831 to 1832, the Santhal Rebellion which rose in 1855, the Bastar Rebellion in central India which broke out in 1910, and the Warli Revolt in Maharashtra in 1940. The movement that Birsa Munda led was one such movement as well. So let's discuss about Birsa Munda's movement. So first let's see who was Birsa Munda and then we'll discuss what he did for the tribal people. Now Birsa was born in mid-1870s in a family of Mundas, a tribal group that lived in Chota, Nagpur. He was the son of a poor father and he grew around the forest of Bohanda, grazing the sheep, playing the flute and all. Now forced by poverty, his father had to move from place to place looking for work. As an adolescent, Birsa always heard how the leaders of his community was urging the people to revolt against the Dikus and how they had to fight for the ancestral right for the community. As these Munda tribe, they considered themselves as the descendants of the original settlers of that region. So Birsa, he went to local missionary schools and listened to the sermons of the missionaries. And there he heard that the Mundas could regain their rights if they leave their bad habits. Later, Birsa also spent some time in the company of a prominent Vaishnav preacher. Vaishnav are actually the worshippers of Vishnu. And he even wore the thread, which showed the value of purity. So Birsa was deeply influenced by all these ideas which he came in touch with his growing up years. So he wanted to reform this tribal society. So he urged the Mundas to stop drinking liquor, to clean their village and stop believing in witchcraft and sorcery. Birsa declared that God had appointed him to save his tribe from the slavery of the Dikus, and his movement was aimed at reforming the tribal society. Birsa also turned against the missionaries and the Hindu landlords. He saw them as the outside forces that were ruining the Munda way of life. In 1895, Birsa urged his followers to recover the glorious past. He talked about the golden age, that is the age of truth, where Mundas lived a very good life. They planted more and more trees, they practiced cultivation to earn their living, they stopped killing their relatives and brothers, and they lived honestly. And Birsa also wanted people to once again work and on their land and settle down and cultivate their fields. Soon thousands became the followers of Birsa, including the Santhal tribe and the Oraon tribe. Soon the Britishers took notice of this movement and they started becoming worried. Now what worried the British officials most was the political aim of the Birsa movement. What was the aim? It wanted to drive out the missionaries, the money lenders, the Hindu landlords and the government and set up a Munda Raj with Birsa as its head. So the Birsa movement actually identified that all these forces were the cause of misery of the Mundas. Okay, so as the movement spread, the Britishers arrested Birsa in 1895. See here we can see Birsa Munda, and convicted him on the charges of rioting and jailed him for 2 years. When Birsa was released in 1897, he began touring the villages to gather support. He used traditional symbols and language to rouse the people, urging them to destroy the Ravana, which were the Dikus and the Europeans. And these people, they attacked police stations, churches, and raided the properties of moneylenders and zamindars, and they raised the white flag as a symbol of Birsa Raj. Now in 1900, Birsa died of cholera and the movement faded out. So even though the movement faded out, it was significant in two ways. First, it forced the colonial government to introduce laws so that the land of the tribals could not be easily taken over by the Dikus. Secondly, it showed that the tribal people had the capacity to protest against this injustice and express their anger against colonial rule. So that's all for the chapter 4, Tribals, Dikus and the Vision of Golden Age. Tune in soon for the next session. Thank you so much. May God bless you all. Take care and bye-bye.